On the night of July 31st, 1999, two 17-year-old best friends climbed into a black sedan in Dothan, Alabama, and drove off toward a birthday celebration that would never happen. J.B. Beasley had just turned 17 that very day. Riding beside her was Tracie Hawlett, her closest friend since middle school. The kind of friendship where if you saw one girl, the other was rarely more than a few feet away. They were headed to a field party in the next town over to celebrate. Instead, they took a wrong turn in the dark, ended up 20 miles off course, and never made it home. Just after 11:30 that night, Tracie called her mother from a payphone outside a convenience store to say they'd gotten turned around, but had directions now and were on their way. Those were nearly the last words either mother would ever hear from her daughter. By the following afternoon, both girls were dead, and it would take 20 full years. A genetic breakthrough nobody could have predicted in 1999, and a killer who spent 2 decades hiding inside the same small community he'd terrorized before anyone finally learned who was responsible. This is the story of how that happened, how a piece of forensic evidence sat frozen in a lab refrigerator for 2 decades while an entire town lived beside its killer without knowing it, and how a completely unrelated arrest 3,000 miles away in California finally cracked a case that traditional police work simply could not. Let's go back to the beginning, because the world these two girls grew up in matters to understanding just how unthinkable what happened to them really was. The summer of 1999 was by almost every measure one of the more comfortable stretches in recent American memory. The economy was riding a dot-com boom nobody yet understood the ceiling of. Bill Clinton had survived impeachment and was coasting through his final stretch in office. Pop radio was wall-to-wall Backstreet Boys and TLC. And down in the Wiregrass region of southeastern Alabama, near where the state borders both Florida and Georgia, the city of Dothan carried on the way small southern cities do. 60,000 people, most of whom knew their neighbors by name, where teenagers spent their summer nights at backyard cookouts and long, aimless drives on flat county roads, never once thinking there was anything out there worth being afraid of. J.B. Beasley was the kind of daughter parents brag about without meaning to sound like they're bragging. Born July 31st, 1982, she was a member of the Junior Honor Society, a cheerleader, sharp and driven and well-liked. Her mother, Cheryl Burgoon, would later describe her simply as a gift. Tracie Hawlett had lost her own father when she was only 4 years old, and by high school she and J.B. had become inseparable, the kind of friendship where plans for one automatically included the other. No discussion required. Both girls were seniors at Northview High School in Dothan. The night of July 31st was supposed to be a celebration. Around 10 o'clock, the two girls left Dothan in JB's black Mazda, heading toward a field party roughly 10 miles north in the neighboring town of Headland. They never arrived. Somewhere along the way they missed a turn, and rather than correcting course toward Headland, they drifted the opposite direction entirely, ending up more than 20 miles northwest, in a town called Ozark, a place with no obvious reason for two Dothan teenagers to be passing through after dark. Just past 11:30 p.m., their car rolled into the lot of a convenience store and gas station on East Broad Street. The store had already closed for the night, but as luck would have it, a woman named Marilyn Merritt and her daughter happened to be there buying sodas from an outside machine. The girls got out and asked for directions back to the main highway that would carry them home to Dothan. Merritt gave them clear, simple directions. She'd later tell investigators that everything about the encounter felt completely ordinary. The car was clean, the girls were polite and a little flustered about being late. Nothing about their voices or their manner raised even a flicker of concern. At the payphone bolted to the corner of the store's exterior wall, Tracie called her mother, Carol Roberts. Her voice sounded completely normal. She explained they'd gotten lost, that they finally had directions, and that they'd be home soon. The very last thing Tracie said before hanging up the phone was that she loved her mother and would see her shortly. Merritt watched from the parking lot as the black Mazda pulled out, turned right exactly as she'd instructed, and disappeared down the road toward the highway. No one would ever see either girl alive again. There was one more detail on that store's security footage, though nobody understood its significance at the time. A grainy image captured a small white pickup truck parked at one of the gas pumps at almost the exact moment Tracie was on that payphone. No purchase was ever recorded from that pump. No one recognized the truck. No one ever identified its driver for years afterward. That blurry frame of video would remain one of the case's most persistent, unanswered question marks. The next morning, when neither girl had come home, both families reported them missing. That same morning, Ozark police were notified about an abandoned black Mazda parked on a stretch of road called Herring Avenue, less than a mile from the payphone where Tracie had made her final call. When officers arrived, nothing about the scene screamed emergency. The car showed no damage, no sign of a collision or a struggle. It simply sat there, seemingly abandoned. The gas tank was nearly empty. One window was cracked open a few inches. The doors were unlocked, and JB's driver's license sat visibly on the dashboard. Both girls' purses were still inside, untouched, cash, jewelry, credit cards, all of it exactly where it should have been. The only thing that appeared to be missing was a small keychain of JB's, spelling out a short phrase in colored letter blocks. Because Dothan plates were on the vehicle, Ozark police contacted the Dothan department, and an investigator was dispatched with the simple intention of arranging a tow. For 6 hours, that car sat on the shoulder of Herring Avenue while nobody thought to check the trunk. It wasn't until close to 2 o'clock that afternoon, while waiting on the tow truck to arrive, that the Dothan investigator discovered the trunk could actually be released from an interior lever without needing a key at all. He popped it open. Inside were J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, both dead, each killed by a single gunshot wound from a 9mm handgun to the head. Both girls were still fully clothed. There was no obvious sign of a physical struggle in the way they'd been positioned. But smaller details told a very different story once investigators looked closely. Tracie had been shot at close range in the temple. There were fresh scratches along her arm and briar thorns clinging to the fabric of her pants. Her sneakers, brand new, purchased only the week before, were caked thick with mud. Both girls had mud and moisture soaked into their pant legs up past the knee, evidence that at some point that night they had walked through wet ground or thick grass somewhere far from where their car eventually turned up. Based on the way the bodies had been arranged inside the trunk, investigators determined Tracie had been placed in first, with J.B. positioned on top of her. A spent 9mm shell casing rested loosely on Tracie's leg. Robbery was ruled out almost immediately. Every valuable item in that car remained exactly where it had been left. And it was clear from the physical evidence that Herring Avenue wasn't where the girls had actually been killed. It was simply where their killer had chosen to leave the car afterward. The initial autopsy found no obvious signs of assault and no alcohol or drugs in either girl's system, but more than 2 months later, the Alabama State Crime Lab delivered a finding that reshaped the entire direction of the case. Traces of semen were discovered on JB's clothing. An unidentified palm print was also lifted from the underside of the trunk lid. District Attorney David Emery told the press plainly that this now appeared to be a sexual crime, or one that had, at minimum, originated from a sexual assault. If investigators could ever identify whose DNA that was, they'd very likely have their killer. That theory turned out to be exactly correct. Finding that person, however, would take 20 years. Dothan and Ozark went into a kind of shock that doesn't fade the way ordinary grief does, the kind that seeps into a community and simply stays there. People looked sideways at neighbors they'd known for decades, wondering, however irrationally, who among them could be capable of something like this. 2 17-year-old girls, on a birthday night, found in the trunk of a car. A sizable reward fund was raised almost immediately. The pressure on local law enforcement from the public and from the families was enormous. And exactly 1 month after the girls' bodies were discovered, a man walked into the police station entirely on his own. His name was Johnny William Barentine, 28 years old, a part-time mechanic who lived less than a mile from where the Mazda had been abandoned on Herring Avenue. He told police he had information about the case. Over a recorded interrogation lasting several hours, Barentine gave investigators a story that shifted shape almost every time he told it. First, he claimed he'd seen a dark-colored truck speeding away from the area that night. Then he said he'd given a ride to a stranger covered in tattoos who'd been hanging around the convenience store. By his final and most detailed version, Barentine claimed this tattooed stranger had gotten directly into the girls' car in the parking lot, told Barentine to follow behind, driven to Herring Avenue, pulled the girls out, and shot them both while Barentine listened from nearby, after which he said he simply drove the man home. Police arrested him. Local news covered it extensively. For a brief window, the entire community exhaled, believing the nightmare was finally over. Then the case against him began falling apart almost immediately. In every single version of his story, Barentine never once mentioned any sexual assault, despite the fact that investigators already knew from the crime lab findings that a sexual assault had almost certainly occurred. The tattooed neighbor he'd named had a rock-solid alibi for the entire night in question. And when Barentine's own DNA was finally tested against the crime scene sample, it didn't match. Eventually brought before a grand jury, Barentine admitted the entire account had been fabricated. He'd invented it, hoping to collect the reward money. He hadn't witnessed anything. He knew nothing. The grand jury declined to indict him, and he was released. The case didn't just reset to where it had started. It was arguably worse off than before, because months of investigative resources had been poured into chasing a story that turned out to be pure fiction, all while the actual trail grew colder by the week. Investigators kept working other leads. A man from Michigan who'd been at a nearby party the same night and couldn't account for several hours of his evening, and who'd left town abruptly within days of the murders, was tracked down and questioned. Investigators flew out to interview him multiple times. His DNA didn't match. A separate man from Mississippi who'd been staying temporarily in Ozark and vanished shortly after the killings was also brought in and tested. No match there either. And that grainy image of the small white pickup truck at the gas pump, the one captured on camera at almost the exact moment Tracie made her final phone call, was never traced to anyone. Every promising lead eventually dead-ended, and each dead end left behind one more gap in an already thin case file. The only thing that still had real evidentiary weight, 20 years on, was that untouched DNA sample sitting in a lab, and it matched no one in Alabama's criminal database. Whoever had left it behind was still out there, free, unnoticed, and completely unknown. The years kept moving forward. The 2000s came and went, then most of the 2010s, Dothan grew, changed, added new neighborhoods. Kids born after 1999 grew up hearing about JB and Tracie only secondhand as a story adults told in careful, lowered voices. But for Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon, time didn't pass the same way it did for everyone else. Every single July 31st, they relived that entire night all over again. The pay phone, the last I love you, the taillights turning right into the dark and never coming back. The file technically stayed open at the Ozark Police Department, but there was no real forward motion. The DNA sample sat carefully preserved in storage, the only physical thread connecting the present to the man who had done this, and year after year, it matched absolutely nothing. The forensic technology of 1999 wasn't sufficient. Neither was 2005, neither was 2010. Alabama's criminal DNA database only held profiles from people who'd actually been arrested or convicted of crimes, and the man they were looking for had no criminal history whatsoever. No reason his DNA would ever have been collected by anyone. The case slowly calcified into one of the most notorious unsolved murders in Alabama's history, revisited in anniversary news pieces every 5 years, discussed endlessly on true crime forums, remembered by longtime Dothan residents every summer when the humid air rolled back in and the memory of that night came with it. But remembering wasn't the same as solving it. 20 years passed with no name, no arrest, no closure, just two mothers growing older with a single question that refused to leave them: who killed my daughter? Then in April of 2018, an arrest 3,000 miles away in California changed everything, even though nobody in Alabama could have guessed it at the time. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man known for decades as the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least a dozen murders and dozens more sexual assaults across California in the 1970s and 80s, was finally arrested after more than 40 years running free. What made that arrest historic wasn't just the man himself, it was the method used to catch him, a completely new investigative technique called genetic genealogy. Rather than searching for a suspect's DNA directly inside criminal databases, which by definition only ever contain people who've already been arrested, investigators instead ran the crime scene DNA through public ancestry websites where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily uploaded their own genetic profiles simply to research their family history. From there, investigators could locate distant genetic relatives of the unknown suspect, build out an entire family tree, and slowly narrow the field down, not by searching for the killer directly, but by searching for his family first, and working inward from there. Ozark's police chief Marlos Walker followed the DeAngelo case with more than passing interest, because he had his own unsolved file sitting in his own office, a DNA sample nearly 20 years old that had never matched a single name, two girls who still had no justice, two mothers he personally knew were still waiting for answers. He reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, the private forensic genetics firm that had played a central role in identifying DeAngelo, and asked them to run the 1999 evidence through the same process, search the public genealogy databases, build out family trees from any genetic matches found in Alabama, and see where the trail led. Parabon took the case. Their analysis returned a list of Alabama families whose genetic profiles bore some resemblance to the sample recovered from JB's clothing all those years earlier. When Chief Walker reviewed that list, one name stopped him cold, a name he recognized from his own school days: Coley Lewis McCraney, 45 years old, born and raised in the Dothan Ozark area. A long-haul truck driver and part-time preacher at a local church, married to a woman named Jeanette with 2 children. He had no criminal record whatsoever, no history that would have ever placed him on investigators' radar over the previous 2 decades. Around town, McCraney was simply a familiar, well-regarded presence, someone neighbors chatted with over the fence, someone his congregation respected and looked up to. Ask nearly anyone in Dothan about him, and they'd have had nothing negative to say. And that, precisely, was why his DNA had never once appeared in any criminal database in 20 years. Walker didn't approach McCraney as a suspect that risked spooking him into silence or worse. Instead, he simply invited McCraney down to the station as a longtime local resident who might be able to help with an old case. A friendly conversation between 2 men who'd known each other since high school. Walker told him directly that he wasn't considered a suspect, but that police needed his DNA to help rule people in or out as they closed in on their actual target. Jeanette McCraney sat beside her husband during that conversation and encouraged him to cooperate. She had no reason whatsoever to suspect anything was wrong. McCraney agreed without hesitation, sitting calmly while an officer collected a simple cheek swab, with no idea that the genetic family tree Parabon had already constructed had pointed directly toward him before he'd ever walked through the door. When the results came back, there was no ambiguity at all. Coley McCraney's DNA was a direct match to the semen sample recovered from J.B. Beasley's clothing back on August 1, 1999. When confronted with the results, McCraney denied everything, claimed he'd never known either girl, had no connection to them, and hadn't even been in Ozark on the night of July 31, 1999. On March 15, 2019, nearly 20 years to the anniversary of the night the girls disappeared. Coley McCraney was arrested on multiple counts of capital murder and rape. The reaction across Dothan and Ozark wasn't relief so much as disbelief. The shock wasn't that the case had finally been solved after 2 decades or that a piece of genetic science had accomplished what traditional investigation couldn't. The shock was the name attached to it, a preacher, a father, a truck driver, that half the community could put a face to. Someone people had nodded to on the street, sat near in church pews, made small talk with about the weather or high school football. Not one person, including investigators, had ever once considered him during 20 years of looking. It was a slow, uncomfortable realization settling over an entire town that the man responsible had simply continued living an ordinary life in their midst the entire time. Going to work, raising his children, aging alongside everyone else, while Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon sat at home, still waiting. When Carol Roberts heard the news of the arrest, she was too stunned to speak for several minutes. Cheryl Burgoon cried, both women had waited 2 decades for this exact moment. And now that it had arrived, it didn't bring the clean sense of relief either had imagined, just old grief resurfacing, mixed with a fragile new hope that a trial might finally give them the full truth. The trial was originally scheduled for 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic delayed everything by 3 years. It wasn't until April of 2023, 24 years after that July night on Herring Avenue, that proceedings finally opened in Dale County. McCraney, now 49, sat at the defense table facing 4 counts of capital murder and 1 count of first-degree rape. The trial ran roughly 8 days, with dozens of witnesses and a mountain of physical evidence entered into the record. Carol Roberts and Cheryl Burgoon sat in the section reserved for victims' families for the entire proceeding. McCraney chose to take the stand in his own defense, a considerable risk in any criminal trial, since it opens a defendant to direct cross-examination with no shield. And on the stand, his account was completely different from the flat denial he'd given investigators back in 2019. Now he claimed he'd first met JB months earlier at a shopping mall in Dothan, that she'd introduced herself under a different name, and that the two had exchanged phone numbers and arranged to meet in Ozark that specific night. He testified that his truck had broken down at a gas station due to a mechanical issue, that he happened to run into the girls at the payphone by pure coincidence, and that they'd offered to drive him to where his truck was actually parked. He claimed he and JB had consensual sex in the cab of his truck, and that the girls then drove him home around 1:45 in the morning, after which he had no further knowledge of what happened to them. When asked why he'd flatly denied ever knowing the girls back in 2019, he claimed he'd been afraid his wife would learn about the affair. The prosecution took that account apart piece by piece. There was no text message, no phone record, no witness of any kind to support the idea that JB and McCraney had ever known each other before that night. Marilyn Merritt, the woman who'd given the girls directions at the convenience store, testified plainly that the 2 teenagers had simply been lost and trying to get home. There was no indication whatsoever of any planned meeting. Tracy's own phone call to her mother, made at 11:35 that night, reinforced the same point: they were heading home, not to a rendezvous. Prosecutors laid out their own version of events based on the physical evidence. That after leaving the convenience store, McCraney approached the girls' car, forced them at gunpoint to a secluded location with dense brush and wet ground, which accounted for the mud and briar scratches on their clothing, raped JB, shot both girls with a 9mm handgun, placed their bodies in the trunk, and drove the car to Herring Avenue before abandoning it. But arguably the most pivotal witness of the entire trial was Jeanette McCraney, the same woman who back in 2019 had sat beside her husband and encouraged him to cooperate with police because she had no reason at all to doubt him. On the stand, she testified that her husband had gone out on the night of July 31, 1999, and hadn't returned home for a stretch of time he could never satisfactorily explain to her. Watching a wife who had trusted her husband for 2 decades testify against him. The same woman whose encouragement had unknowingly led investigators to his DNA in the first place was one of the most difficult moments of the entire proceeding. On April 25, 2023, after 8 days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The following day, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all 4 counts, guilty of murdering J.B. Beasley during the commission of a rape, guilty of murdering Tracie Hawlett as part of the same criminal episode, guilty of murdering both girls during a single continuous course of conduct, and guilty of capital murder involving the use of J.B.'s vehicle during the crime. A specific provision under Alabama law that elevates a case to capital murder when a victim's own vehicle is used in the commission of the offense. The following day, jurors reconvened to determine sentencing, their recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors had originally sought the death penalty, but the sentence handed down still guaranteed that Coley McCraney, 49 years old at the time, would never walk free again for the remainder of his life. When the verdict was read aloud in court, Carol Roberts was left speechless for several minutes. She later said simply that she was stunned that after 24 years, someone was finally being held accountable. Cheryl Burgoon broke down in tears the moment she heard the word guilty. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, who personally took part in prosecuting the case, addressed reporters afterward, and acknowledged plainly that no verdict could ever bring complete closure to a loss this profound, but that it did finally answer the question both families had carried unresolved for nearly a quarter century. Coley McCraney is currently serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Alabama. In a phone interview conducted from prison, he continued to maintain his innocence of the murders, specifically telling reporters that people could call him a cheat or an adulterer, but that he had not killed anyone. The Beasley Hawlett case became one of the earliest and most significant examples in the country of genetic genealogy, successfully cracking a case that had defeated every traditional investigative method available. No criminal record to search, no reliable witness, nothing but a single DNA sample sitting untouched in a lab for 2 full decades. In the years since McCraney's conviction, hundreds of other cold cases across the United States have been reopened using the same technique, and families who had long since given up hope have received phone calls they'd stopped believing would ever come. There are practical lessons buried inside this story that are worth carrying forward, especially for parents and for young people heading out on their own at night. Always share a specific itinerary before leaving the house, not a vague "I'm going to a party," but the actual location, the host name, a working phone number, and a realistic time you expect to be home. If those plans change even slightly, call and update immediately, the same way Tracie did the moment she and JB realized they were lost. In an era of smartphones, there's no real excuse for going missing without anyone knowing your last known location. Real-time location sharing with at least one trusted person, especially at night or somewhere unfamiliar, costs nothing and can matter enormously. If you or someone you love ever has to stop at an unfamiliar, empty place after dark, the safer instinct is to stay inside the locked car and call for help rather than step out to ask a stranger for directions. If there's any way to avoid it, and trust your gut, if a situation feels wrong even without a clear reason why, leave, call 911, or head toward the nearest crowded, well-lit place. But maybe the hardest lesson this case leaves behind is the simplest one. Dangerous people rarely look the part. They can be the neighbor who waves from his porch, the familiar face at church, someone you've crossed paths with 100 times without a flicker of suspicion. Staying alert to that isn't paranoia. It's simply the kind of awareness that every once in a while ends up being the difference between getting home safely and becoming the reason a community spends the next 20 years waiting for an answer. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing and sharing it forward. Cases like this won't only stay solvable because people keep telling them, keep remembering the names, and keep paying attention. Thank you for watching all the way through, and we'll see you in the next one.